only got a couple less lessons left in Unit 2, Part B, presidency. And so we got some of the stuff is a little random now. It's not quite as topical. So we got a couple things about presidential staff, like the president and his staff and who helps him enforce the law. And then we have just kind of a random card. So we just have to deal with that. All right. So presidential cabinet is first. 2.48 presidential cabinet. All right. Pop over to the back side. All right. One, the presidential cabinet is the heads of the executive department. All right, the heads of the executive department, which I'll show you a chart in a second here. And there are 16 members of the presidential cabinet. That includes the vice president. There are 15 official departments that have been created by Congress. Remember, Congress is the one that creates and funds the departments. The Senate approves of department heads or cabinet heads, okay, cabinet members. And the president is in charge of them. So here's a picture of President Trump meeting with his cabinet. Their job is to implement the law. Okay, implement the law, enforce the law, run programs. They're in charge of their department doing that. And also they are to carry out the president's agenda. Carry out the president's agenda. So you can see here on the right-hand side, the executive branch, you got Secretary of State, State Department, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Labor, Treasury, Defense. By the way, one note on the left, halfway down on the left side is Attorney General. That's Department of Justice. So the Attorney General is like the head lawyer for the United States government, and they're at head of the Department of Justice. Secretary of Interior with Parks and whatnot. Homeland Security is the newest one that was created right after September 11th. So all these people, or at least the heads of the departments, are supposed to carry out the federal government's law that's passed by Congress, signed by the president, and also the president's agenda. So there's a bigger view. By the way, also these people are in the succession for president. They're in the line after the Secretary of State and President pro tem. These people would be in line to be president in a certain random order in some cases. All right, 2.49, the White House staff. So also people to help the president. You got the cabinet members, that's one, and then you have White House staff, which are more informal. The cabinet is actually mentioned in the Constitution because it says executive officers can be appointed by the president, whichever, depending on what Congress creates. So that's kind of those are actual constitutional positions. But White House staff are informal. Since they're informal, they don't require the Senate approval. So the president on his staff at the White House can actually, appoint anybody he wants. So yeah, presidential appointments. The most important White House staff member is the chief of staff. And this is the person who runs the White House, really just almost like a dictator, and the president's schedule. And you don't get to see the president unless you go through the White House chief of staff. And also this person is typically the president's chief advisor or main advisor. And a lot of times presidents go through, a couple or three or four chiefs of staff per term just because the job is so intense that they just don't last very long. I mean, you're giving up your entire life to work for the president. And lucky if you have a family, forget about seeing them. 2.50. So this is kind of the random card I was telling you about. And we're talking here random. We're going to cut back here. Presidential campaigns. And we're talking about the difference in kind of tactic to win an election versus primaries, which is when you're trying to win the nomination of the party, versus the general election, which is the election that we hold in November. So what's it like when you're in the primary running against other members of your party versus the general election when you're running against a person of the other party? And usually it's, pretty much two people running against each other. So what's the difference? Well, primary voters, the people who vote in the primaries for their party to choose who will be the person voted on in the fall, they tend to be way more liberal on the Democrat side and way more conservative on the Republican side. So that means that in the primary, you're probably going to, on the Democrat side, hear people talk about more liberal policies because they're appealing to that primary voter. And then on the Republican side, you're going to see the exact opposite, where they're kind of much more conservative in appealing to those, much more so than the general public, which is much more moderate. So what ends up happening as a result of that is that candidates appeal to more extreme left and extreme right in the primaries. They're much more likely to appeal to a more extreme left or right in the primaries. And the party nominees, quote unquote, tack to the center. That's a phrase to remember. Party nominees will tack to the center and moderate their positions for the general election in order to win. So they act like they're really super liberal in the primary, and then when the general election comes, suddenly they're much more moderate. Or the Republican will sound super conservative in the primary, and then in the general election, suddenly sound a lot more moderate. And that's because although there's a sizable number of people who identify as liberal, and then typically a larger number of people who are conservative. Neither one are the majority. It ends up being those kind of people that are in the middle, that are more moderate, that are end up choosing who will win the presidency. All right, that's our random card of the day, and then you have your White House staff positions with cabinet and White House staff. All right, study those. Know them well.